In our previous episode, we spoke to historian Robert Jan van Pelt about his work on Auschwitz and his involvement as an expert witness in a case against a Holocaust denier. Today is part 2 of the series, where we are in conversation with architects Anne Bordeleau and Donal McKay, who worked with Robert on creating the evidence room at the 2016 Venice Biennale. Self-explanatory in its nomenclature, the evidence room is a room with architectural evidence from Auschwitz to assert the existence of the gas chambers used for committing genocide in the Nazi concentration camp. It presents 3 monuments: a door, a wall hatch and ladder, and a gas column, along with a number of plaster casts as proofs of the crimes against humanities, and underscores the culpability of architects in creating these instruments of murder. I am Vaishnavi Shukla, and this is Architecture of Center, a podcast where we highlight unconventional design perspectives, practices, and research projects that reflect emerging discourses within the design discipline and beyond. Architecture of Center features conversations with radical designers, thinkers, and change makers who are redefining the way we live and interact with the built environment. We're going to talk about the evidence room today, and in Robert's episode, we get a fairly detailed understanding of his research and the court case and the analysis of the Auschwitz concentration camp. Now, his work became the foundation upon which you conceptualized the evidence room for the 2016 Venice Biennale. And since this is a podcast and we don't have any visual aids, and the evidence room especially something where the viewer derives meaning through the experience of the space, through navigation, I'm going to take this opportunity to ask both of you to walk us through the evidence room from your perspective.
Oh boy. The problem is we have at least 3 different evidence rooms. We have an evidence room now in Pennsylvania, half installed. So it was abandoned. It was just abandoned in place at the beginning of the shutdown, and they haven't gone back. It's sitting there in a state of I don't know what in a museum in Philadelphia.
And it was in Washington D.C. right before, no, or someplace else? Okay.
So it's been in Venice. It came to Toronto, where it was much expanded and reconfigured in a way that I think was probably a better reconfiguration. Although the Venice plan, the rooms are en valade in Washington and in the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. The evidence room is not part of a sequence of other rooms with other exhibits. It's part of a larger field of exhibits, but they're no longer sequentially organized. And in fact, the Washington organization is frankly a bit cranky, I think, but that's okay. It was done in good faith and done well, but it was very tricky.
I can give you the main elements and components of how it was first envisioned for the Venice Biennale, and in a way that responded to the invitation that was sent to Robert Jan. And I think it came with the possibility of originally selecting, not so much any room, but there was a possibility of different rooms. And in the end, the room that we fell on was a smaller room, but which worked perfectly for the purposes, in the sense that it was sort of a room that had no access to light from the outside. And it was really a kind of tucked between 2 other rooms. So that's what Donald is referring to. It was an enfilade. So you would come in sort of coming from another room into the center, and then just walk across, and then the next door was in the center, and you go into, it was sort of tucked between 2 exhibitions. It could be a room that would be left open, but then the evidence room was occupying this space. So, and we knew, in terms of presenting, the evidence room was really presenting the evidence of Auschwitz, and there were 2 different strategies in presenting these. We never intended to present the replicas or reproductions of anything that would be in Auschwitz, but at the same time we were trying to hold as remaining as truthful as possible to the elements that we were going to be showing. So in terms of the evidence, there was in terms of how they were translated, I guess, imagine walking into a room and there are three large one-to-one elements, and these we refer to as the monuments. So these three monuments were in some ways sort of freestanding in the room and occupied the center as well as one of the walls. And this was the gas column, a door to a gas chamber, showing the two sides, the sides of those who were the victims and on the side of the perpetrators, and also a ladder towards another type of gas chambers, which was above ground. And then so there was a small hatch that needed to be opened from the outside, and that was the third monument. So there are these three monuments that occupy the room that maybe from a first, upon entry, those would be the components that one would most readily recognize or see and sort of wonder. They're all white. All the monuments are painted white, even though different materials have been used to build them. And then so these sort of stand in a room, which also is very white. And then as you take your view from those key monuments, then you realize that two of the walls are then lined, and those walls from which you come in, where the sort of door is punched out of that wall, there's the sort of the shelving unit, which we call the matrix, that also comes with its ceiling. So it sort of lowers and controls the light that comes, but also is, it sort of creates a room. It completes the room. While the matrix is lined on those two walls with casts. So there would be the matrix, the casts, and the monuments. So those three monuments and some 40 plus casts. And those casts most of the casts were very shallow casts. They were translating drawings, photographs, letters, using different techniques, and we can go into these later. But they also included three more like three-dimensional casts that were directly cast from objects. And so there was a gas mask that was really sort of protruding from one of the walls. There was a can from Zyklon B pellets that was also protruding, as well as the cast of a motor, which was essentially a motor that was used to for the fans that would then accelerate cremation, to be very blunt in terms of what was that. So these were the three components. There were in many ways, they could be one of many. Those exist. They're elements that could be bought off the shelf and used for different purposes than from the one in which they were used in Auschwitz. But then in their isolation and the way in which they were cast, and they sort of stood as, again, a kind of incriminating element. So I don't know if there's anything that you want to add, Donald.
Well, there are a couple of things. It's interesting, the idea of the room, of the evidence room, of literally that sort of cage that you see in television shows and films and criminal procedurals, where there's evidence or something's missing in the evidence, or someone's taken the evidence, so they go get the evidence. Inevitably, it's a kind of cage, filing cabinet, lots of shelves. So that occurred within the first 90 minutes of conversation about the whole thing. Began with a conversation between Robert and myself and his wife, Miriam Greenbaum, when they invited me to lunch and said, "Do you want to do this?" And I've been involved with Robert in some of his projects for years, and like 25 years probably. So I understood all of this stuff, but in some sense, I never go into it in the depth Robert does, because it's so karmically scarring. It's just awful. So I'd rather think of something else. But what was interesting is, and I think this would be a theme that you're going to find between Robert, Anne, and myself, is that there's a kind of overlap in the idea of a narrative and the idea of an experience. Now, if you had to polarize this all, Robert is a pure historian and a very interesting amateur architect. And both an architect and an historian. And I'm an architect and an occasionally amateur historian. So and it's very clear as I work on anything else I'm doing that I am much more preoccupied with the experience of something than I am with the narrative or the interpretation. I'm probably pretty close to anti-interpretation. Robert is very strong on the interpretation. And I think in some sense, Anne is the most moderate among the three of us, which is a great position to be in. It has always helped. I mean, really, the first couple of hours were really, you hardly ever sit around and think there's the genesis of this thing, but that lunch was the genesis of this thing, where you said, it's a room. And then we said, well, what happens at the Biennale? I hadn't been to a Biennale since the mid-70s, late 70s, I more or less said, I'm not going back till I'm invited. So getting invited was a good thing. But my sense was, as in all of these things, that there would be an awful lot of words, there would be a lot of graphic, there would be a lot of audio visual, there would be a lot of interactive, there would be a lot of color, there would be screaming for attention. I mean, Renzo Piano had a room, I think it was Renzo, it was Piano or Foster? I think it was Piano room, which was the hottest pink in the planet, like, look at me. And I thought the only way that we distinguish ourselves is by being incredibly ghostly and calm. And because we're talking about architecture, to talk about it as a room, I mean, I'm not going to go very deeply into this, but in spite of the fact I resist the institutionalization of both the academy and architecture, I know full well I have the DNA of an architect. But for me, the room is an incredible metaphor for the self. The self sits at sort of the threshold of that room and saying, the room is one's being, and there's no way I can escape it. I can speak of mental health in terms of the span of your arms and the space you occupy in your mind. But what was very interesting was to actually say, we are going to deliberately make a room. It's a room that you could pass through in a moment like a dream, or you could reflect on for some period of time. But whatever else it would first of all be a relief from everyone else saying, look at me, look at me, look at me. But it would also reward slow, thoughtful gaze. And that's where I think the collaboration of the three of us is terrific, because I think Robert is second to none in his capacity to go into an archive and never come out without the right stuff. Anne did a magnificent job of taking several narrative strands out of Robert's research, this vast book of evidence. And my whole sense was that my contribution was in somehow saying, you have to be able to experience this as a room. I mean, Robert was at a certain point, I had that 2 weeks after we started, I had to sort of take him out for a sandwich and sit in the middle of the park and kind of go, we're not doing that. But he was all for kind of trying to figure out how the room would reenact the trial. You said, that's an event that happens in time. This is an event that happens in space. You can't turn the space into an act. No one will put up with it. No one will go, here I stand and I'm about this, there. And he got it right away. Of course, what am I doing? I said, you're a writer. You're a brilliant writer and a terrific researcher. I tend to make things. And I said, this is about, how do we express this in a space? It's a room, not a theater. And we got that. And when Anne joined the team and made one stunning contribution at the outset, which was to help simplify the matrix, which was all 4 walls, and that was fine. And I could figure out how to do it, but we were saving money, and it was actually smarter for it to turning into 2 walls of that were great, because it meant that there was a larger conceptual space for these 3 monuments to locate themselves in. And their location is quite studied in the sense that they don't establish any axis. They are very much set out in a field. And if you looked at it, you'd say, well, that's kind of a Miesian field, how these things are arranged, or kind of neoplasticist or something. And that was quite deliberate, given the initial envelade organization of this sort of neoclassical building that we're in. It is in the concept of a room that you get it. Whereas most other people sort of thought, I think, that this is an exhibition space. I will locate my objects or my tableaus in here. We really did understand it was a room, and we initially designed it so that the entire enterprise could have been freestanding. We could have put this room up in the middle of a football field and it would still be a room. And in fact, that is finally how it's evolved, because in time, for security reasons, I became much more preoccupied with how to anchor it to the walls. We were very apprehensive about vandalism. And I thought, it has to be as stable as possible. So we fastened it much more securely to the building. And once we had done that, the building came to depend on it. So we have to, every time we put up, or they put up the evidence room now, they have to actually build a building around it. It's a temporary building, but it's a distinct building. So the room and the experience of the room was very important to doing it. But when you get in, Anne's gift for arranging this narrative in the casts, I don't think I ever entirely understood. All I knew was at a certain point, all the weight was moving to the front of these shelves, and I was panicking. But that's another story. But it was not really panicking, but I was unnerved. But I realized that the weight had gone so off axis of the shelves, we had to reconfigure their engineering in mid-process. That really started to build up the layer. So it becomes an intersection of narrative and experience. And I think it's 1,000 times better for that intersection.
But I think it's interesting that it's very true that part of that was not a reenactment of, what happened in the courtroom, or that in fact it was happening in space. But I think there's something, I still think it's very interesting, that specific room where we're located, in between very busy other rooms, the fact that it was designed or thought about in the context of the Venice Biennale. And I think, that room was sort of like a room between rooms. But I also think temporarily, like in relation to time, there's something really quite significant that was happening when we think of people just kind of zooming through all the exhibits, and everyone is kind of competing with one another in terms of like, what is, how much light or how much color or how busy can the exhibition be so that it will really capture someone's attention, and can be sort of read quickly or entice someone to stay longer. And I think the way the room operated was the complete opposite of that. In a way, it opened up, a different type of space, but also maybe a different relationship to time, in how you walked in. And it was really, it could be completely lost on someone who would just walk too fast and just kind of dismiss the room as like, oh, nice white, clean presentation. Or if you spent just enough time to realize what was being presented, then it would, the familiar, what apparently, you could sort of dismiss as something of a super sort of clean aesthetic, suddenly became very unsettling. And what seemed like just a fast walkthrough had to translate or be transformed into a very involved engagement with what was being presented. Because even though there are some of those narratives that were kind of alluded to in the 4 different walls that lay on each side of the doors, it was still, not everything is there. The narratives only can be deciphered in between all of the fragments or all of the evidence that is being presented. So it takes time. It takes time, and it's also, it's difficult material to look at. So it takes time, investment, involvement. So it's not really a reaction to, or it can't be really a distracted view. One really has to immerse themselves in the exhibition in order to kind of let it, to grasp its significance.
And nailing it there, but I think there are specific things architecturally that are actually worth talking about for a few moments. One of them is I have an established and perhaps even outsized interest in the problem of thresholds. I think we erect personal thresholds in the persona that we make in the world, but just to say, this once again, the room is a kind of psyche, I suppose, or a being with a psyche at its doors. But it turns out in the Biennale, it was very hard to make a threshold into the room. It was, in fact, what happens were that no one was treating the room, the spaces in that building as rooms, even when they're very distinct. And we were very lucky to find a small one that had 2 doors. It was great. It was like we just, sometimes you just fall backwards into it. You've got the right instincts and it works. But it was the sense that you could be a threshold. Eravena, who's a really terrific gent, and the curator of the exhibition, we were the disciplining that went into controlling the idea of making a threshold into these spaces so that there's actually a momentary transition. That was a real struggle, and it became smaller, more minimal, but still a space, because you stopped. And going through the doorway, you could actually turn 90 degrees and read the walls of that threshold, read the walls of the doorway, because that was, in fact, the message. That was where the text was literally in the doorway. And then you walked into the room, and any text thereafter was actually embedded in the plaster casts of the document. And there was no other explanation. There were no tags or anything. And that other tags for this business came up in several other iterations. And instinctively, museum directors and curators have understood, no, that's not a good idea. That spoils this thing. But there's also, and I think there's 2 artists that I would have to call up. And one would be Anselm Kiefer, who does not work in things that are pure white, but definitely works in this stuff. There's actually probably 3, but there's Anselm Kiefer and George Siegel, who actually also did a Holocaust monument, but Siegel's sort of plaster full life things. I think without I was being entirely aware of it, I think I was quite aware of them. And of course, then there's, oh my God, Anne is going to help you with this.
Well, Rachel Whiteread or Giuseppe Pennone, yeah.
She works with casts and yeah.
And I know that Rachel Whiteread plays an even more important role in Anne's vision of this than it does in mine. Kiefer is somehow in mine, except that, of course, with Kiefer, it's all about the texture and the tone, the color, and the degradation of surfaces and things. Kiefer likes rust. I like rust too, but I didn't want that there. We didn't want that there. But those were all things. And the problem of understanding that you can't really have a room until you have a threshold into the room. It's not like you don't pass through an almost invisible membrane. You pass through an introductory space, which is not subordinate, is actually the space where you, in some sense, put aside your umbrella, wipe your feet, take off your hat, and enter, or reverse that process. You go from inside to outside. And I think there was a very much an inside-outside thing, which is how, in the end, I'm very happy that almost all the other exhibitors played into our hands. They were not making rooms, so there was people were not going from an inside to another inside. What was happening on the exhibits on either side of us was they were definitely outside. They did not claim the space in one sense, because one of them was just so overambitious and elaborate and crazy that you kind of, this is all about objects. And in every case, they put things in the middle of the room so that the audience could never stand in the middle of the room. The evidence room, you
are the opposite.
You are present in the room. You are not like, when some of these artifacts were exhibited, the CCA, in an octagon space, sure enough, that we were told, no, we know exactly what to do. We do this. So we just hands off. You can't say anything. We walked in, and sure enough, they had put the gas column right smack in the center of the space on the axis of two suites of rooms with all these lights and things. And you kind of go, this is the most shameful thing in European history. And you've given it the honored place. And you realize that what happens is, I think the three of us are actually more sophisticated than we understand. We did not honor these things, but we actually set them up and established them. I mean, the word monument in this case is, of course, counterintuitive. These are not things one wants to monumentalize, but as opposed to, equestrian statues of Confederate generals, which people do want to monumentalize, these were exactly the opposite. No one is ever going to find these things honored. What they are is represented as kind of ghosts. And
but they do still end up becoming monuments in a way, right? I mean, I think even the way we talk about it.
Absolutely, because a monument is simply a built reminder, so the sense of there being, what I like about monuments generally, and of course I especially like cenotaphs, because cenotaphs mark passings of people and places, times, without being that place or those people or that time. I mean, one of my favorite moments in France is to visit the cenotaph for Camille Claudel, which is in the graveyard where her body was just dumped. No one knows where her bones are. They just know they're in a box with hundreds of other bones of other people. But there's a cenotaph, and it's actually the best of the many, many, many Camille Claudel sites that I visited. Most of them are really vulgar or stupid. This one is simply a cenotaph, a monument, but not a monument to that spot or that time or that person, but a reminder that they are somewhere else. So we did call them monuments, and I think that's the right term, but in fact, in some sense, they operate as cenotaphs. And I think that that's important to understand the typology a little bit.
Yeah, I think at one point we're also looking at them as, partly like relics. Just, there's a dimension of this, but I think in relationship to the monument, we did call them monuments, but there's so much of the the way in which even the exhibition presents itself, or the fact that it was one of those, to a certain extent, like memorial to the perpetrators. Like there were so many paradoxes in terms of what was being presented, how it was being presented, that I think, there are monuments, or they're in some ways like are they trying to just bypass what monumentality might mean in terms of it's not really about elevating, it's not really about, it comes from the reminder. But I mean, even this column, which to me, ultimately, and this is something that I'm sure Robert Young talked about in terms of in the trial, there was a notion that if there was no holes, there was no Holocaust. And with that, they were referring to the fact that this column, they could never prove the existence of this column because, the notion that the hole that would have gone through the roof of the underground crematoria was no longer visible. So the absence of a hole, right, was something that we were trying to, or proving the existence of this hole was partly what the reconstruction of the column was attempting to do. And in that, like, you're trying to bring materiality to something that was always a void. It's, there are all of these kind of apparent contradiction in how we were working through this, which is also why I thought that casting was such an amazing medium or process to speak about this, the presence of an absence, it's like the positive and the negative, light and darkness, the present and the past. And if, Donald was talking about, yes, Rachel White-Reed or someone like Giuseppe Pinone, there's also, I'm always go back to the work of the archaeologist, I think Giuseppe Fiorelli, who was working in Pompeii. And he made like an astonishing discovery, because rather than trying to dig into the ground to look for things, their presence, he just started becoming very attentive to what was not there. So, using his ears, maybe rather than his eyes, he would just knock into the ground until, he would feel like maybe there's an echo, and then just put a little hole, fill it with plaster. And then those are the casts that we can still see to this day in terms of the, what was the people who died in the Giardini dei Sospiri, like that you would go and see, and then, but there's the ability to retrieve something that is now absent. So I think, it's bringing to mind the Cenotaph, as Donald is saying, is interesting, because it's a place that actually, in which the body is absent as well. Right, Donald? If I remember, like, as opposed to the mausoleum.
The cenotaphs are fascinating, because I'm sure that we have lots of them forever. I mean, I think Roman arches are a sort of an architectural version of the Arc de Triomphe, those things. But really, my strong impression of them is that they become a 19th century invention, which just explodes in its significance after 1918. And you end up with very prominent architects like Lutyens working on cenotaphs. That we will have this thing stand here in London to remind us of all those people who died in France. I think I would still have always called them monuments. I'm happy they were called monuments, but the sort of sense that they are in many, many, many ways cenotaphs are important. Their typology is complex, and I think that's true. Certainly, over and over again, as it's like I have conversations with Americans who will. I mean, Canadians are tearing their hair out about their own collective guilt about the Indigenous people of Canada. Americans are tearing their hair out about. Well, not enough of them, frankly, about the guilt of 3 centuries of slavery. What's very impressive in Washington is that you can go to the Holocaust Museum and hear all about the millions of people murdered in Europe. There's no American Holocaust Museum for the millions of African Americans who drowned on the journey, or were tortured to death, or lived their lives, worked to death, and then lived in centuries afterwards in states of humiliation. And you think, God damn it, like it's all right to have these reminders. So I like the evidence room, because it's a reminder not of how noble the victims were. They were victims. It was neither nobling nor ennobling. It was awful. They were not even in some sense martyrs. They were simply murder victims of the worst sort. But to sit there and say, we're going to remind you that this was a deliberate, almost aesthetic practice. This was an act of purifying a place. And in the same sense that, each of us lives in countries where there are over and over again, there rise these people who say, we are going to purify our race, our nation, our city, our color. And say that, that's what I find impressive about the evidence room in the end, is to say, this murder was in their mind a work of art. And we have to understand that fascism is inevitably an aestheticization of politics. So when a young man appeared, apparently I was not there, and was so dismayed at how apparently beautiful he thought the room was. And one of my younger and very bright colleagues was left to defend it. The only thing I would have said to him now is, of course it isn't. Have you ever looked at an SS uniform? It's the height of exquisite tailoring. It's like, you cannot look. We researching years before on the problem of Auschwitz with Robert, where we were working through what eventually became the material, which was the treaty for its preservation. We had hundreds of photographs of people being loaded onto trains and taken off trains and lined up. And you could not see those people until you put your thumb over the picture of the SS officers. They were so glorious. They looked so good in those uniforms. And you think fascism is aestheticization. And so to actually say, we're going to take your stuff, we're going to treat it as the commonplace horror that it is, a beaten up door, a worked out iron shaft, a made up hatch, a piece of carpentry. And we are going to, in some sense, aestheticize it for another reason. I mean, there's a lot of architecture being practiced in that room very quietly. And I think it's important for us to feel proud of having been architects over this problem, not simply people who walked in and said, well, here's the stuff, here's the evidence, you judge. But to actually say, sorry, we've formulated this so you know how deliberate we are about how you see this.
But I've been trying to gather my thoughts about everything you've been saying, and something that fundamentally is very profound and surprising is the nomenclature itself, right? Just calling it the evidence room implies that there's been a crime that has been committed, or an alleged crime.
Exactly.
And the fact that the whole room emerged as a result of a court case with somebody who was a Holocaust denier kind of just ties everything and puts everything in such an interesting context. And I'm trying not to use the word interesting a lot, because I was watching these series on Netflix and it says interesting is a non-word. So I'm going to try to rephrase. The way the evidence room comes across is, of course, a monument, but also a piece of history that stands today in a completely different context, away from the time when it actually happened, as a reminder of what had happened. But if we go beyond, talking about Holocaust, say in 2016, and maybe take a step forward towards even looking at it as an art installation, and that's where, the question of narrative and interpretation comes in, is the choice of color. And that's something that I've thought about, even after we spoke the first time and we were looking at your work, is the tactile qualities of putting together this room, maybe not as an architectural space per se. So we talk about the threshold, and we talk about how everything that is supposed to be seen is put on the periphery, leaving the center open. Something that's very dominant and imposing, which color white usually isn't, is the choice of the color. And I was thinking about it more in terms of how poetic the place is, because the color is set to, aim to homogenize everything that exists within the room. So the matrix or the gas column or the chamber. And one way that I really interpreted the choice of color, and we'll talk about, the identity of the designer and how that plays in, is in Hindu culture in India, where I'm from, and I believe a lot of other South Asian cultures, maybe even in Buddhism, when there's a death. So when you take a body for cremation, or when you have the mourning period or the grieving period and you have a condolence meet, everybody dresses in white. That's very different from, say, the Western culture, where white is a color of celebration, right? So people generally, like brides, wear white during the wedding. And in the Western culture, black is a color for grieving the departed souls. The way I was reading white was as a color that somehow tried to kind of slow down time, pause the time, if you were to say, or even bring in the element of peace. I mean, just universally, white is a color that stands for peace. I was curious, however, how or why you would not have chosen any other color. Again, if you're talking about grief and really looking at all the horrific activities that happened, talking about millions and millions of people who've died. If the idea was to memorialize, not on the perpetrator side, but the victim side, the memorial to the murdered Jews does. But if black was a color that would have gone more in that direction versus white, I'm just very curious about how at this point, the role of the architect or the artist plays in terms of making something open for interpretation, or how completely the same things, had they been painted in red, if you were to symbolize violence or anger, what that would have done to somebody's experience of this space. And then, of course, at the end of the day, you always wonder, how does the identity of the designer play? What does our background as people who've had a certain kind of education, who've been born and raised in places where we've not experienced this kind of crimes or this kind of violence, how do we stand as a conduit to bring a certain idea to life so that everybody who walks through the space has a certain reading of it? And I know you guys, when you were designing, when we spoke initially, you said, well, you could just walk past it and not be affected at all, or you could spend hours in the space, going through each and every cast and have had a very visceral reaction to the whole thing. A lot of stuff. Sorry, I just went off, but I'm constantly thinking about this.
I wonder if I can just start, and Donald, I mean, of course, if I can say, I'll start with something that, came before I even joined the project, which was why I got invited to participate, which was the selection of the casts. So I think the white, to an extent, comes from, or is related. Of course, we could have done something to the plaster or to, what we're pouring to add pigment if we had wanted to. But I think there was, so the fact that we're using plaster, or actually hydrocal to be very specific, which has a bit of cement in it, but, and those casts would be white, maybe is one reason. But I think, in everything that you say, and maybe even going back to what Donald was referring to in terms of the aestheticization, that was, another answer that we can. And I remember that time when this person was saying, why did you make it so kind of beautiful? Why, and, really troubled by, especially because that someone kind of appreciated the room until they sort of realized what they were looking at. And I think there are many answers. One of them has to do, yes, with the material that was being used in terms of the exhibits or the casts, and that being white. I think casting was, so it's not just a color, there's a materiality. It's inherent to the material that was used, and it's a kind of cold, heavy, sort of sobering, mute and somewhat, sort of pure, and so I think, and in a way also sort of ghostly, like the plaster really only carries sort of a trace of a contact, and, refers to, and it's dual in temporality. So I think that the fact that it was casting played a big role, certainly in relation to the exhibits. And then the decision to carry this to the monument, I think, was also a way of saying, this is not a copy, they stand as they are, and you're confronted with a presence. And it's both trying to bring what was being presented closer, because there were elements of the past that you're trying to, you're co-present with in the room. But I think the white also enables a certain distance that was also very important. I keep referring to, there's a text that I always show to my students in a slightly different context, but it's Giorgio Agamben talking about being what is the contemporary, and he's saying that in order to be true contemporaries, it's not those who are too close to their own time, who cannot really sort of establish a distance with it. They're not true contemporary. They're just kind of like stuck with it. And he's talking about the importance of this anachronism, or this, being slightly out of phase. And I think the white enables a bit of that distance that then lets you look. Even when you talk, I'm thinking of a number of the images that we have from the atrocities that were perpetrated in Auschwitz. Night and Fog, Alain René's film, is one of those. And even if it's a black and white film, like it's so horrifying. It's hard to watch. And I think the white, in a way you could challenge the decision, because it seems to make it more, mute and more acceptable. But I think in bringing it to this sort of apparently neutral and possibly sanitized, like Beatrice Colomina is looking at the history of modern architecture, saying like it was this whole effort to sort of sanitize it. We're not trying to really sanitize that history, make it like look harder, easier to just sort of look at, but to some extent by establishing that distance, and yes, giving it a more, not so much aggressive, but less violent, or usually violently shocking look, then it opens the opportunity to actually really engage with it, and look at it like for better or for worse. So I think that's another answer. The only other thing
I buy your argument, because the only reason why I want to talk about the color is why it is generally, I'm not saying Beatrice Colomina was right, but just it's associated with a certain like preciousness, it's supposed to be immaculate, it's supposed to be impeccable, but also knowing that in today's day and age we do have the means to change the color of certain stuff, and while there's inherent color in the materiality of it, and Donald mentioned earlier there was whoever, Renzo Piano or Norman Foster building a hot pink room out there. I guess when you put it in the context of being contemporary and bringing in the element of anachronism, that makes sense, because it means that a certain factor of timelessness to the whole thing, just because of the choice of color, and it kind of makes it more universal or more timeless. I don't know if that's what you guys intended.
Well, I'm going to slip. Everything Anne said is sound. There's two things that I really have to talk about here, though. And the first would simply be coincidence. And the thing to understand, if you live in the domain of psychoanalysis, I seem to live in, you have a lot of faith in coincidence, because you understand that coincidence is not the coordination of events that the outside world is putting together. It's the coordination you're put in your mind, that you have in your mind, that puts them together. So in some sense, you'd say the white is at least in part the product of coincidence, okay? Like you say, plaster, what is the most authentic color for plaster? A kind of white or creamy white as it ages, until you spend your time with Rodin's plasters or Camille Claudel's plasters, and you realize, oh, they age. That's very interesting. And then we think, well, ours will age. One of the things just to remark on inside this is to say, I've been in that room when I watched two young women, remarkably stylish women, and they came in and they were entirely fascinated with it, but they ran their hands over every surface. It was as if they needed the braille. And I was thinking, when we installed in Washington, there were art restorers removing all the evidence of those fingers from earlier exhibits. And I thought, I'm not sure we should be doing that. I think these things should get progressively a little grubbier, in the same sense that the Rodin plasters are now, various stages of brown and cream and whatever. But the first thing is to simply say, white begins as an act of coincidence. The odd thing about the matrix is that it was powder coated in a factory which had been previously powder coating material for the new Guggenheim in the new Whitney in New York. And the white that they were using was referred to as Whitney white, which is the white that Renzo Piano had chosen. So we thought, that's funny. That's great. So we had Whitney white throughout everything. So there's a kind of like, okay, that was fun. Those go together. And it went on with that. The notion that white represents purity is to say, haven't you read Moby Dick? Please. The trick in Moby Dick is you don't know whether the whale is in the end the great force of nature that overwhelms these murderous sailors, or the embodiment of all natural evil. It is. And that brings me to the second question, which is to say, it ain't all explicable. There are blind spots inside it. And just as there are blind spots in our vision, we live with blind spots. The notion that it should all explain itself is a bit like believing in Chekhov's gun. I don't believe in Chekhov's gun. There can be a gun in the second act and it can never be used. And the notion that you suddenly say, what does the white mean? You say, the white is here in part out of coincidence, part because it's a kind of an interesting default, and in part because it does not always represent purity. If you're Chinese, it is definitely the color of funerals as well. If you're Melville, it is definitely a question. What is this great white whale about? In some sense, it's a blind spot, not necessarily open to interpretation at all. And I think that's just as important, is to say, I can experience this without actually aggressively saying this is what it means. Because every time we interpret it, we diminish the experience. And sometimes you just think, I want to be in this room and just feel it. And which is why I think the young woman running her hand over everything was really interesting, because she was not running her hand over it going, this means this and this means that, and that's how the story goes. She was actually, in some sense, committing it to her body when she did that. And people did that again and again. And we made it clear people could touch this, these things. And that is to say, unless you are reading in Braille, when you run your hands upon it, you're not sitting there saying, this is what it means. You are actually saying, this is how it feels. And I think that's really crucial, because this whole sort of thing that you kind of go, the exhibition is not a 19th century novel. The hero does not come out in the end. The villain is not bad looking. It's way more complicated now. And I think the sense that there's a blind spot where you just don't quite know is okay. That it's a good thing. That the notion is all. It's one of the problems with teaching, and one of the problems with architecture is I have to explain this. You say, the hell I do. Why? How about we actually just take it in?
Yeah. I think Donald.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, like, I like your answer. I also say, like, another way around this is to say, it's like you don't need to explain it. But I think to some extent, another approach is also to say, like, there are 15, 20, there are multiple ways in which you can start to interpret it. Like in what you said in terms like, this is just about, you have to experience it, which was, the absence of caption, or that just try to go in without the kind of external explanation and interpretation. But I'll just add 3, potential answers, just because, if there are 25 answers, there might as well be none, and it might as well be a mystery. But I would say that for us, in terms of working with Plaster, even the, Whitney White, and you should have seen, like, I think the image, quite vivid image that I have is, the touching up of, like with tiny little, brushes, touching up this white. And I think the white was really a color of care. And I think it's not so much to sanitize, but I think preserving, and remember, like, when we're doing the cast and we're trying to make sure that they would come out as well as they could and don't really get much residue, or we have to be really mindful around them, at least until they would be on the wall. It was really a way of honoring the memory and honoring, respecting the material, trying to be as truthful and, being as mindful as we could be in how we treated, this evidence that in the end to us had importance. I mean, I would also say for me, like this notion of the white is really like, which seems like a bit of an eraser, right? It's as though like but I think that's all going back to the paradoxes that we're talking about in terms of the absence, or proving the existence of a whole. And I think, finally, I just found it, there's something that did go back to the origins of some of the mythical origins of architecture or drawing a line, where I think it was quite phenomenal that in a lot of the readings that the only, it's sort of written white on white, and it's really the light that is cast and it's the shadow that enables you to actually make out what the image is saying. And then sometimes it disappears, which I think was really important as well, that they weren't just that easy to read, that you have to move around and try to see in relation to the light.
To move around.
I'm gonna pick up on something that Donald say on this. This is actually one of the questions that I had thought about, Donald, when you mentioned the young stylish women walking through it and, running their hands across the whole thing to kind of internalize the whole thing. I've been to one Venice Biennale. This was 2014 when Rem Koolhaas was the curator with the Elements of Architecture exhibition. And I know for a fact that an exhibition like the Biennale is accompanied by swift glances of the audience with a need for instant gratification from the pavilions. And I was pretty young. I mean, I was on exchange in my undergraduate program. So my understanding of the things that were exhibited in the pavilion was quite limited, to be honest. But I was one of those swift walkers across the exhibition. And the evidence room, in a way, contradicts the conventional expectations from an installation. So one can choose to engage, immerse, and interpret, but one also has the option of walking by without reflecting or reacting at all. And in fact, something that Anne said during our initial conversation, she just said it was a quote by historian Paula Wong Lee, who said that it's not a place for showing, but a means for knowing, almost indicating that the evidence room, for example, would never belong to an art gallery, but it could belong in a museum, and I think it did. This is a kind of provocative question, but given the whole story behind the evidence room and the way it did turn out and all the places that it's adapted itself to, you think there's ever a time when it'll surpass its meaning or the semantics and the symbolism that it has right now and find itself in an art gallery, or you think that's completely off the table?
It found itself in an art gallery.
It already did?
At Washington, it's an art gallery. It's fantastic.
Oh, really?
Because we're sitting between a pair of Giacometti's and a Bacon painting. No, it's an art gallery, and I have to say, I think I may have taken a photograph of the thing in relationship with Giacometti's and just sent it to my daughter, saying, "God, we finally made it. We're there with Giacometti," which would be a thrill for me. No, and the fact is, at the ROM, the director of the ROM, who's a very interesting guy, was titillated by the tension involved in this question. Now, when it came time for the project to be evaluated financially, which we had to, and I'm sorry if there's banging in the background, they're renovating upstairs and I cannot stop them anymore.
That's okay.
I've had enough of my bad temper. But when it was evaluated, the evaluator, who's a very wise wise middle-aged guy who's been around a lot of this stuff, came out and said, the trick with this thing, and the thing that actually makes it so valuable, is it's not like anything else. He said it's got both of these traditions, and it does all of these kinds of things. We can't call it an art installation. We can't call it a piece of architecture. It's not a sculpture. It is this combination of things. That's what makes it unique, and to my mind, what makes it valuable. And he was talking about, how do I translate the cultural value of this into a market value, because someone's now about to put some money into it. And that was interesting because up until then, we never imagined there was money in it. It cost a lot to make. There was never a sense of like, oh gosh, this is about. We were faced with the fact we didn't have the money to ship it home. We were going to have to very subtly dump it into the canal. It has value as an artifact, and it's not going to shed that value. It may, because of COVID and because COVID has so discouraged the foundation, and because the foundation is really hanging on the favors of more just one or two people, it may have a very dark period for 20 years, but it ain't going to go away. It's going to come up again, and the manuals and the films and all the stuff explaining how it goes and what it works will all be there, and it will get reconstructed. I spend an inordinate amount of time right now uncovering stuff that is apparently lost, partly because I've become, among other things, a publisher, which is very tricky. But I'm publishing some stuff from, it was lost in the 60s, and you dig it all up and go, this has to come out. And it exists. You cannot deny it. You can't escape it. It sits there in history. Somebody will find it in 50 years. If it goes into a warehouse and is closed up, it will still not be lost. So it will endure. And that seems fine.
I mean, it's true. It was very interesting to think about. I mean, even when it was being prepared to be presented at the Biennale, this is also when we had an invitation to present part of it at the Canadian Centre for Architecture. So 2 slightly different venues. And then at the Royal Ontario Museum, much more sort of broader, more general public, and in the very interesting area of the museum. And then at the Hirschhorn Museum. And I think what was very interesting is, of course, like these all become context within which the, exhibition, the room is being inserted and then read. And it's then becomes, it's interpreted in relationship to itself and the story that it presents, but also in relation to what one might expect from coming, the different audiences and what they might know and what they might be looking for. I thought it was, I don't really have a clear point here, except to say that every time I was really stunned by in every venue, I think there was always an urge to try to explain. And I think a lot of the places that we've went, curators or the people who were responsible for the exhibition were really uncomfortable with this, the fact that it was just given. And I think there were 2 sides to this. One was just also saying that actually some of the people that would come don't even know what the Holocaust is. And, they really felt they had a duty to at least give some ground or some, lessons or some reminders and context in that sense. So that was one. But I think there was also the other one, which is maybe more reflective of contemporary society need to kind of grasp things or try to explain and be able to understand as though things can be fully comprehended, and try to give as much detail. So even some of the questions that I think Donald is refusing, rightly so, to sort of answer is like, well, there's no interpretation, it is what it is, and you make of it what you can, see in it. Although there's a lot of really clear intentions, there are other things that just come from it being, right? And it being in different circumstances. But to me, that was very, it brings up a lot of additional questions as to what we are willing to engage with, the kind of inexplicable, the inexcusable, the horrifying, the incomplete, the things that get buried and maybe forgotten. Like, I don't know, I think that to me is the real urgency in, helping ourselves deal with those elements of our past. And yes, Donald was talking about the past in the United States, but similarly in Canada now. And, you're talking to us, I don't know if I can say on the the day after the first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, where there's a lot of horrifying, there's a genocide in Canada's past. And so how is it that we can both honor that truth and also build ways in which we can engage and acknowledge and either forgive or, reconcile, and to use the term that is being put forward. But and accept that it won't ever be fully understood, and we will never unearth. Yeah.
But
yeah. Oh,
can I come back in here, because I think explaining, or not, and discussing this well. She's not explaining. There's a couple things that I might preface this with, and one is to say, and we should, that the Royal Ontario Museum broke its back to put this in context. That in retrospect, we had substantial committees of voluntary, people involved in the community in various ways and things. And we went through everything, and we expanded the exhibit, and they saw this exhibit in time and space. And so, in fact, there was the creation of a room where people who might be badly affected by the experience of the thing could go to relax and sit back and calm down. Everything was going on. It was actually very subtle and quite remarkable. And in retrospect, at the time I thought, well, there's a lot of work. We'll do this, and this is great and terrific, because I get very pragmatic. In retrospect, I realized how very professional, how incredible they were about actually facing the fact that the context of this thing in a city like Toronto, where more than half of the people in Toronto come from outside of Canada. So it's like, and that's primarily the audience for the Royal Ontario Museum, or Torontonians. So it really, said we have to fill up this whole context. This is an event here, and I think that's actually a sort of crucial part of the thing. There is a kind of context, and it contributes to it. I think the other thing which is interesting, and it was hard to escape it and work with it, and it's a distinction that I make between ourselves and the identities that are imposed on it, and referred to, and I did refer to, for instance, the current Canadian conscience examination in relationship to the nation's Indigenous people. And you think, these things cut 73 different ways. Joseph Brant, one of the most celebrated Indian chiefs in Canada, had 40 Black slaves. These are not easy questions to go looking at. But the thing that's interesting about it is that I think one of the things I liked about the room was that it resisted identity in favor of a kind of self-examination. And I think every time we come up against identity, even in the best of intentions, the best of moments, we have to understand it as a commodification of our very complex selves, the incredible reduction so that they can go into a political or a cultural or an economic marketplace. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about the room and about the people working on it and everything else is that no one involved in the thing ever became preoccupied with an identity. And we didn't present it as a question of an identity. We presented it in terms of a lot of people it's happened to. And I think that's one of the other important parts. We exist and will for the balance of my life probably in a domain where the politics of identity are going to be crucial in the marketplace, in political life, in cultural life. And I'm a self-confessed old white guy, and all the people I work with aren't, they're everything else but what I am. And we laugh about it all the time. But we also all understand, and we're working on books, we're making movies, we're publishing books right now. There's quite a posse of us at this point. we are trying to figure out how to address what we see as the positive aspects of this question of identity without surrendering the much more soulful questions that we all carry around as individuals. And in some weird way, the evidence room was able to skirt this dreadful question of identity to a certain extent. I think it's very important that it did. So
I think this is the perfect transition into my last question. And of course, the Holocaust happened decades earlier, but we're also, as you mentioned, living in a time and age where violence and acts of crime continue to be perpetrated in different forms, in different geographies, by people with different identities. I'm curious if you've thought about any, I don't want to use the word contemporary, but any iterations of the evidence room that reflect upon the, well, maybe genocides happening today in different parts of the world, or if the evidence room has the potential, I guess it already has become one, a template or a medium or a form to really be a space where different events or different kinds of violences have space to be out there for people to experience. I don't know if that, I'm trying to find the right words, but I know you get it. My question is, what's next for the evidence room? Does it take a new life, one that is more rooted in the time we're living in, one that rethinks the space, one that evolves its existing space into something that captures everything? I mean, it's a pretty weird time to be alive in. Even if you think of COVID and the number of deaths COVID has had, it's of course not a genocide, but it's a mass.
You know what? In the denial of it, it is a genocide. Right now, I would sit and say that Trump, Bolsonaro, other politicians like that who use it for political ends are frankly fascist murderers. I don't think we should back away from the politicization of something that has such incredible and immediate, profound consequences for hundreds of thousands of people. No, it goes on all the time. I think I'm sorry, Anne, I'm going to talk for a moment, and then I'll shut up. I think there are several problems. One is in the tempo of things. You, for instance, cannot make a university behave like a newspaper. A newspaper, the event happens and it immediately explodes in headlines, and the next day the headlines correct the previous day, and the day after that there's a longer story, and it goes on. Journalism is about the immediate moment. The evidence room, in some sense, comes out of an academic environment, the product of one man's research for 30 years in a larger community with a number of other people who all come together in the shelter of a university, establish this institution within the university and make this thing and then take it out and present it to the world. That's not journalism. That's something else entirely. It's probably architecture. And we could have a conversation about architecture and literature, but I'm going to leave Sartre at the door for now.
I see what you did there.
It's a way too big a question, but it is right now. I think there are hundreds of evidence rooms going on. I mean, sometimes they're immediate, sometimes they're just a demonstration, sometimes they're a headline. Like I've said, we're publishing right now. I'm in the midst of publishing 14 books. Among them is a book which addresses the Magdalen laundries of Ireland, which were basically a class and gender genocide, cultural genocide that went on for hundreds of years over women who did not behave like the church wanted them to behave, who might have had children out of wedlock or been promiscuous. I'm doing another one. We're publishing another one on the wall between Israel and Palestine. These books, for me, operate in some sense the same way that the evidence room does. And there's more. And some of the other things you're publishing are frankly a little gentler, which is a good thing. But it is it's not. The evidence room happens once because someone gave us a room and the time, and we had this environment, and we could behave with this kind of thoughtfulness as opposed to the moment's newspaper. And the academy will never be journalism. It will never respond as fast because it has to respond much more thoughtfully. It has to respond to much greater depth. It has to consolidate its knowledge because it has greater responsibility. It's not there to sell tomorrow's newspaper. It's there to try and evolve the truth as it verified. And that's what evidence was about in that case. So the evidence room was the evidence room, and it will stand there, and it will probably at some point seem quaint to someone. And that's life. That will happen. Other things will happen. There was a conversation that we had for a little while about could we begin something on walls? And I was sort of having a fantasy that we actually could begin to erect a kind of colossal exhibition about 4 or 5 of the sort of traumatic walls in the world, including, for instance, the fascinatingly imaginary Donald Trump wall at the southern end of the United States, or the wall between Israel and Palestine, or several others, all of which have to do ultimately with the most savage application of the idea of identity on people, right? You protect your Israeli identity, you protect your American identity, you protect your Palestinian identity. And it's all to say they're very hurtful, they're horrible. And we understand that they exist at the level of regions. And China right now clearly has a whole region which is walled. They're 2 big questions. And in fact, thousands and thousands of people are tackling them every day. We tackled one, which was, one room, one moment, one terrible long story, which in some sense came to an end, but left a shadow that's still there. So does it have an influence? It has an influence on all the people who worked on it. It has some influence on some people who stopped to study it or helped to exhibit it. And
some people who interviewed people who designed and made it.
Exactly. And in some sense, I would also say that the memory of the evidence room and the team, because it really was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life, and I've had a lot of great times in the domain of the academy in architecture and art. It was a great experience. Has managed to inspire me to just keep working through all sorts of other things in all sorts of ways. And I presume that work, I know Robert is, I know Anne's up to things. But no, the evidence room probably have the closure. And this is coming from a guy who right now is trying to make a movie that would be a 120-minute film loop, so you could come in any place in the movie and follow. I hate beginnings and ends, frankly. I'm now having a tough time with narrative thresholds. But
I think that's interesting. I mean, I would say I don't think often about, what's next for the evidence room. Like so to me, some of the questions that really drew me is, yes, I think the importance, I'm also an architectural historian, and I am not engaged in history just to preserve the past as past, but I really highly value the ways in which we can understand history now and continue to keep it alive. But I'm always really interested in questions of how we move between times and how we situate ourselves in our own times and how that encompasses our understanding of past histories, etc. So all of this to say, there was I think it's one of the books that Anna Arendt, it's a collection of different writings. It's called Between Past and Future. I wish that was only my way of introducing that book, which again is looking at time. But I think as part of this book, she's talking about how these essays were prompted, and she calls them exercises in thinking. And I would say that to a certain extent, the participation in the evidence room provided a pretty meaningful opportunity to think, like through a number of really important questions. And then some of these questions remain to be, like there'll be other exercises, and there are other exercises where we're taking, they're questions that have to do with the specificity of what we're looking at, but also broader questions that, even what Donald is alluding to between the identities and just the sort of commonness and, our human souls. And I think those are really important questions. So I would say, I think as a work and, in its material existence, the evidence group is no longer for our, the fate of the evidence group is, I don't think, no longer mine to determine. I think it lives, or maybe it won't, but I think that's for someone else to figure out. But I think what I really see in terms of some of the lessons, both as a thinking exercise, but going back and alluding to what, again, Donald is just mentioning, is the way in which we tackled that exercise was so incredibly meaningful. Like the fact that it was part of, yes, Robert Jan's research, Donald and everything that it could bring in, but also, Sasha Hastings, who was a participant in this as an arts producer, Bruce Kuwabara, who is a true fundamental believer in the project, and all of the students, and, Piper Birnbaum, Anna Besnagova, Alex Vilku, Anna Longrig, Shoban Allman, like Brad Paddock, and there's more, and Carol Kaifosh. Like I could go on to the way in which we came together as different individuals working on this project, and in a really and all of the questions that you're asking today were questions that we're asking ourselves in the process, and for which we have maybe different answers or no answers. But I think I learned a lot from this process and the act of questioning and working through, as architects, in a way, as designers, as but also as thinkers and as people who care for, sharing some of that work and then seeing where it goes next. But I think that's what I would say. I don't know about the work itself, but in terms of the process that we collectively, undertook and defined together, to me, that was very meaningful and something that I could see putting at work again, whether in the school, outside, I don't know. But yeah, I would say that was the main significance of that work for me.
That's beautiful. No, but I'm so glad to have come across your work, and I especially want to thank Robert, because I reached out to him and he's like, well, you know what, you should speak to Anne and Donald, and I'm so glad I did. Thank you so much, Anne and Donald, for your time.
You're always welcome for a visit. Thank you so much, Visnavi.
Special thanks to Ayushi Thakur for the research and design support, and Kahan Shah for the background score. You can send in guest suggestions to our Instagram account, ArcOfCenter, or through our website, arcofcenter.com. That is ARCHOFFCENTRE. Thanks for listening.